Brazil spent over $15 billion to host the 2014 World Cup. They built brand new stadiums in the middle of the Amazon jungle, stadiums that to this day sit almost completely empty. Meanwhile, the country was in the middle of one of its worst economic crises in decades. Hospitals were underfunded, schools were crumbling, and millions of Brazilians were living below the poverty line. So how does a country justify spending the equivalent of an entire year's education budget on a single sporting event? The answer, as you're about to find out, is both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Because the World Cup isn't just a football tournament. For some countries, it's a trap, a dream sold to politicians and citizens alike. A promise of prosperity that, more often than not, never actually arrives. And in the process, real people lose their homes, lose their rights, and sometimes lose their lives. This is the story of what the World Cup actually does to the countries that host it. The story they don't show you between the goals and the celebrations. Let's begin. Every 4 years, it starts the same way. A country raises its hand, it submits a bid, and it makes a promise to the world, and more dangerously to its own people, that hosting the World Cup will change everything. More tourists, more investment, more jobs, more global recognition. FIFA calls it a legacy. The host nation calls it a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And the media calls it a triumph of national pride. But here's what they never tell you in the opening ceremony. There has never been a single independent economic study that conclusively proved a World Cup host nation made a positive return on its investment. Not one. In fact, economists have a phrase for this. They call it the winner's curse. The countries that win the right to host the World Cup are often, in a very real sense, the ones who lose the most. And to understand why, you have to understand who actually controls the World Cup and what they want from it. FIFA, the Fédération Internationale de Football Association. On the surface, it looks like a sports organization, but in practice, it operates more like a global corporation, one that earns billions in revenue from tournaments it doesn't have to fund, build for, or clean up after. Here's the business model, and it's almost elegant in its simplicity. FIFA awards the World Cup to a host nation. That nation then spends years and billions of dollars building the infrastructure FIFA requires: stadiums, transport links, media facilities, hotels, security systems. FIFA comes in, runs the tournament for about a month, collects the broadcasting rights, the sponsorship deals, the ticket revenues. Then FIFA leaves, and the host country is left holding the bill. For the 2018 World Cup in Russia, FIFA reported revenues of over $6.1 billion. Russia, the host, spent over $14 billion preparing for it, and saw only a fraction of that come back through tourism and related spending. For Qatar 2022, the most expensive World Cup in history, the numbers become almost incomprehensible. Estimates put Qatar's total spending at somewhere between $220 billion and $300 billion. FIFA's revenue? Around $7.5 billion. Now, Qatar is one of the wealthiest nations on earth, so the financial damage was different there. But the human cost? That's where the story gets dark. Very dark. Imagine this. You're a young man from Nepal, or Bangladesh, or India. You've been struggling to feed your family, and then a recruiter shows up in your village, well-dressed, carrying documents, making promises. Come to Qatar, he says. There's construction work. Good pay. You'll send money home. Your family will be safe. You borrow money to pay the recruitment fee, sometimes thousands of dollars. You leave your country, you arrive in Qatar, and within days your passport is taken away. You're told the job isn't exactly what was described. The pay is less. The conditions are worse. And because of a system called the kafala, a legal framework used across the Gulf, you cannot leave your employer without their permission. You are, for all practical purposes, trapped. This is not a rare story. This is the story of hundreds of thousands of workers who built the stadiums, the hotels, the highways, and the infrastructure of the 2022 World Cup. The Guardian newspaper conducted one of the most comprehensive investigations into deaths among migrant workers in Qatar's construction sector. Their findings pointed to over 6,500 migrant worker deaths between 2010, when Qatar won the bid, and 2020. The Qatari government disputed those numbers. FIFA said the conditions were improving. But the workers who survived told a different story, crammed into labor camps, denied proper drinking water in 45-degree heat, working through the night to meet construction deadlines, all so that the world could watch 90 minutes of football in an air-conditioned stadium. And Qatar is not alone in this story. It's just the most extreme example of a pattern that repeats itself, in different forms, in different countries. Every single time the World Cup comes to town, Rio de Janeiro, 2014, before the first ball was kicked, before the first foreign fan booked their flight, before a single stadium was declared complete, the bulldozers came for the neighborhoods. The Brazilian government needed land for new stadiums, land for new roads, land for the infrastructure that FIFA's requirements demanded. And that land was occupied. Entire communities, called favelas, were cleared. Families who had lived in those neighborhoods for generations were given short notice, minimal compensation, and told to move. Human rights organizations estimated that 250,000 people were displaced across Brazil in preparation for both the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Rio Olympics. Some were relocated to housing projects miles outside the city, far from their jobs, their schools, their communities. Others simply had nowhere to go. And the cruelest part, many of those new stadiums, the ones built on the land where those families once lived, became white elephants almost immediately after the tournament ended. The Amazonia Arena in Manaus, built for $300 million in a city with no top division football team, has been used for local minor league matches ever since. The maintenance cost alone runs into millions of dollars per year. A stadium built for the world, used by almost no one. A neighborhood destroyed, never rebuilt. But what about the economic benefits? What about the tourists, the investment, the global spotlight? Let's look at the numbers. Honestly, South Africa, 2010. The country spent approximately $3 to $5 billion on World Cup preparation. Stadiums, infrastructure, security. The government projected that the tournament would bring massive economic returns, boosted tourism, and long-term investment. What actually happened? Tourism numbers during the event were lower than expected. Many predicted 450,000 foreign visitors. Fewer than 310,000 arrived. Hotel prices had been raised so high in anticipation that ordinary tourists stayed away. The long-term investment boom never materialized, and several of the newly built stadiums began hemorrhaging money almost immediately in maintenance and operating costs. The Cape Town Stadium is a beautiful, iconic structure, costs the city roughly $7 million per year just to keep operational, generating far less in revenue than that. Brazil's experience was similar but sharper because Brazil hosted during a period of genuine economic and political crisis. GDP growth was already slowing, public services were already underfunded, and the spending decisions around the World Cup, fast-tracked, poorly audited, politically connected, opened the door to one of the largest corruption scandals in Latin American history. Operation Car Wash, the investigation that eventually brought down multiple presidents and jailed some of Brazil's most powerful business executives, had its roots partly in the construction contracts for the 2014 World Cup. Billions meant for infrastructure, siphoned into private bank accounts, while ordinary Brazilians waited in hospital corridors that hadn't been renovated in 20 years. So why do countries keep doing this if the economics don't work, if the displacement is real, if the corruption is predictable? Why do nations, sometimes desperately poor nations, keep fighting each other for the right to host? The answer is prestige politics. For some leaders, hosting the World Cup isn't about the economy. It's about the photograph, the handshake with FIFA's president, the opening ceremony broadcast to 2 billion people, the moment where their country gets to say to the world, "We are here. We matter. We are modern." For authoritarian governments, it goes further. The World Cup becomes a tool of sports washing, using the global goodwill of a sporting event to launder a damaged international reputation. Russia in 2018, Qatar in 2022. Both countries face serious international criticism over human rights, over conflicts, over suppression of political opposition. Both countries use the World Cup as a strategic counter-narrative. Look at these beautiful stadiums, the message went. Look how organized we are. Look how welcoming we are. Come visit, spend money, take pictures, tell your friends. And it worked, at least partially. During the month of the tournament, the criticism softens, the stories shift to the football, the world tunes in, and for 30 days, the host nation controls its own image. Then, the cameras leave, and nothing has changed. The Russian opposition is still jailed. The Qatari labor laws are still largely the same. The poverty in Brazil's favelas didn't disappear because Neymar scored a goal. The World Cup came. The World Cup left. And the people who were there before it, the ones who were never really invited to the party, are still there, still waiting. There is one more cost that never makes it into the pre-tournament promotional videos: the cost of disruption. When a country hosts the World Cup, it doesn't just build stadiums, it reorganizes itself. Its economy, its public services, its law enforcement, around the tournament. Businesses in host cities often report mixed or negative results during the event itself. Local residents avoid the city center because of traffic, security restrictions, and inflated prices. Regular consumers who would normally shop, eat, and spend locally stay home. In Brazil, a study found that retail sales in host cities actually dropped during the tournament, as locals avoided the congestion and chaos. Hospitals in host cities redirected resources to prepare for the influx of international visitors, while regular patients waited longer for care. And then there's policing. Every World Cup brings an enormous security operation. In Brazil and South Africa, this meant the militarization of neighborhoods near stadiums. Particularly poor, predominantly black neighborhoods, police sweeps, increased stop and search. Communities treated as security threats rather than citizens. The World Cup doesn't just pass through a country, it restructures it, often in ways that prioritize the foreign visitor over the local resident. For a month, the country stops being for its people. It becomes a product, a stage set, a backdrop for someone else's celebration. After every World Cup, they're left behind stadiums built for a peak moment that will never come again, too expensive to demolish, too costly to maintain, too specific in design for everyday use. They stand in cities as monuments, not to achievement, but to the economics of wishful thinking. Brazil has at least 4 or 5 stadiums widely considered white elephants. South Africa has several. Greece, which hosted the 2004 Olympics rather than the World Cup, saw nearly all of its newly built sporting venues fall into disrepair within a decade. Some overtaken by weeds, some vandalized, some simply locked and forgotten. Qatar's case is unique because the country is so small and so wealthy that the stadiums may find alternative uses. But questions remain about whether a nation of fewer than 3 million people, with no established football culture at any meaningful scale, can sustain that infrastructure long term. And here's the uncomfortable mathematical reality. A stadium that costs $500 million to build and $10 million a year to maintain needs to generate enormous revenue every single year just to break even. In most host countries, that level of sustained revenue simply does not exist for sports venues. So the stadium sits, a concrete shell of a promise that was made, kept for 30 days, and then quietly abandoned. Here's something worth paying attention to. In recent years, several countries have withdrawn from World Cup bids, and the reasons they gave were striking in their honesty. Norway, Sweden, and other Scandinavian nations considered bidding for the 2022 World Cup, then declined, citing concerns over Qatar's human rights record and the ethical implications of participation. Several European nations that were candidates for future bids have seen their bids collapse under public opposition. Citizens and advocacy groups asking their governments directly, "Is this how we want to spend public money? Is this the kind of event we want to be associated with?" This is new, and it matters. For most of football's history, the World Cup bid was treated as an unquestionable ambition. Of course you bid. Of course you want it. What kind of country wouldn't want the World Cup? But a growing number of governments, and more importantly, a growing number of citizens, are starting to ask different questions. What are we actually getting? Who is actually benefiting? And who is paying the price? The World Cup is not going away. And honestly, the football itself, the matches, the drama, the global community that gathers around the sport every 4 years, that part is real and genuinely beautiful. The problem isn't the tournament. The problem is the model. Who bears the cost, who captures the benefit, and how accountability is distributed. Some economists and policy analysts have proposed alternatives, permanent or rotating host regions, where infrastructure is built once, maintained properly, and reused. Rather than each host nation spending billions on new construction, a set of established venues could rotate across a region. Stronger FIFA accountability, where the governing body is required to contribute meaningfully to infrastructure costs, not just collect revenue. Where host agreements include binding commitments to labor standards, human rights protections, and community impact assessments. Democratic oversight, where host bids require genuine public approval, not just political decision-making. Where citizens get a real vote on whether their country should take on that financial and social burden. None of these are radical ideas. They're basic governance principles. The fact that they haven't been implemented in a multi-billion-dollar global institution is not an accident. It's a choice made by powerful people who benefit enormously from the current model. And until that changes, until the countries that host the World Cup are treated as partners rather than products, the pattern will continue. The bulldozers will come, the workers will suffer, the stadiums will be built, the cameras will roll, the goals will be scored, and then, 30 days later, the world will go home, leaving behind empty stadiums, displaced communities, and governments left to explain to their own people why the promised transformation never quite arrived. The scoreboard at the end of a World Cup final tells you who won the football match. But there's another scoreboard, one no broadcaster ever shows. It tracks a different kind of result. How many families were displaced? How many workers were exploited? How many billions were spent and never recovered? How many promises were made and quietly forgotten after the closing ceremony? On that scoreboard, the host country is very rarely winning. The real winners are the ones who never had to risk anything, the ones who showed up, collected their check, and flew home. That's the game inside the game. And now that you know the rules, you'll never watch a World Cup quite the same way again.